Yes.
Okay. So in 1 minute, Maeve, we'll give you the cue.
Sounds good.
Good morning, everyone.
Morning.
Morning.
Hello.
Good morning, everybody. Maybe Jacqueline, you can mute everybody if it's not.
Yep.
Hi. So thank you very much, everyone, to be here today with us. So the Académie Culinaire of France welcome today with the help of Jacqueline, Maeve Webster, who's gonna let us know about the future on flavor and the food. And she has prepared a large presentation for us today. And so I'm going to let her in and she can start her presentation. And we will record today this webinar and we'll post it on our website, and we probably link Facebook and Instagram also. Okay, so thank you so much and let's begin.
Okay, that sounds great. So give me 1 second. I'm going to share my deck.
And I'll just say, Maeve, before you get started, that there is a chat feature for everyone in the Teams call. So as you have questions, feel free to submit them through the chat. We can address those at the end, or you can hold your question, and there's not so many of us here that it's not untenable to just unmute yourself and ask the question live. So I'm Jacqueline. It's nice to see and meet you all virtually. And Maeve, I'm going to hand it over to you.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, thanks everyone for allowing me to share my time with you today. My name is Maeve Webster. I own a consultancy called Menu Matters. I've been consulting and researching in food service for the last 20 years now. Yes, 20 years seems like a long time all of a sudden. And I also actually had my own cafe. So while that closed a year ago and I did not go through the pandemic with the cafe open, it has given me a completely different perspective, having been in the trenches and not just looking at it from a consultant or a researcher's point of view. So what I've done today is I've pulled together a deck that's focusing not on just where we've been. I'll touch on some of that, but more from the point of view of what does this mean to our industry and our operations moving forward? So this is really going to be a forward-looking deck. I have left time at the end for questions, so I would love a robust conversation if everyone has questions at the end. If something's really burning, like Jacqueline said, feel free to unmute yourself and ask the question live so that you don't forget it. So with that, I am going to forge ahead. I'm hopefully going to get that great. Okay, so the first thing I want to do is talk about some of the changes that our patrons have gone through over the last almost a year now, and it will be longer than a year by the time we're actually all through with this. It has been just about a year of intense anxiety, uncertainty, of fear, tension, stress, sleeplessness, depression. As you can imagine, this on an ongoing basis, nearly nonstop really, has incredible impact on consumers' psyche, on how they approach spending money, how they approach day-to-day life. And that has certainly impacted our industry in a number of different ways. But going forward, the biggest thing that this means is after all of that upset, psychically, emotionally, mentally, consumers are really looking for simplicity. They want to feel more confident, they want comfort, they want calm more than almost anything else. And that has led to some pretty significant changes, not just in our industry, but in other industries. So for example, in design, we're seeing Japandi design, which is a combination of Japanese aesthetics and Nordic aesthetics, which you can see very clean, very simple, non-confrontational, very comforting in its colors. This has really grown. Pottery Barn has already made a huge shift in their aesthetic. They've now got all kinds of mindfulness apparatus and products that you can buy. Their entire look has changed significantly. And of course, this has led into this whole return to comfort food. So comfort food, as we all know, really lends itself to that feeling of satiety, warmth, kind of wrapped in something very, very comfortable. But it's really more than that, because ultimately comfort food is non-confrontational. It's very simple. It doesn't challenge the eater in the experience that that eater is going to have. It's something that can be approached with confidence, with calm, because there is nothing about it that will force the eater outside of their comfort zone. We're going to talk a little bit more about the broader meaning of comfort going forward, but ultimately comfort food fits into this idea of the science of nostalgia. Is that a question? Okay. So this whole thing feeds into this idea of the science of nostalgia. Now, often in food, when we talk about nostalgia, we begin to err on the side of kitschiness, sprinkles, fair food, you know, birthday cake flavors. This can often be tied into nostalgia, but it really is almost the most basic form of nostalgia. Ultimately, nostalgia means a great deal more than that. It's this idea of transporting individuals, in this case our patrons, through food and experience into a time that they felt safer, more innocent. It's that elsewhere that was happier, more secure. And I think we can all appreciate that after this past year, we all want to be transported to a place that feels a great deal more secure and a great deal less chaotic in a lot of different ways. So as we talk about comfort, as we talk about the experiences that consumers are looking for, it does not end the idea of innovation. It does not exclude the idea of creating items that might be slightly outside or nearing the comfort zones of consumers. But I think as you're approaching innovation, at least for the next 12 months to maybe 18 months, I'd keep this idea of what the science of nostalgia actually means as you think about the experiences that you're creating, because this is really what's going to resonate with the majority of patrons. And it ultimately gets back to this idea of hedonic adaptation. And I'm not going to have a lot of these charts in here, just so you know. But this whole idea is that all people, have this base point or this set point of comfort and satisfaction and happiness. So regardless of how happy or how great a situation is or how bad it is, ultimately you level off at this set point. You'll see it as the hedonic hamster wheel idea, so that if you're in the middle of something that's incredible and you wanted something for the longest time, you get it, you're thrilled, it's exciting, and then after a short time, it stops being all that exciting and you kind of head back to your set point. Now this is under normal circumstances. Given that we've been through this whole situation for nearly a year, and we will have probably another 6 months of this to look forward to, I guess. Imagine this chart, the set point, almost heading this way, because it's been more bad circumstances than good circumstances for most people, and their set point is essentially resetting at lower levels in order to deal with all the chaos and all the bad news that's happened. So what that means to us is that as an industry, we have the opportunity to begin to raise that set point. And it's going to be easier. Our ability to excite and just touch base with our consumers in a very emotional way is going to be a lot easier because their set point is a lot lower. It's this idea of identifying those peak moments in your operation, in your menu, in the experience that your patrons have. Something like the Baked Alaska, that was developed to really cut through a lot of noise and then create this incredible moment that really elevates somebody's happiness. It's that idea of surprising and delighting. Now, given where we're at and how the hedonic adaptation and most consumer set point will have lowered a bit, the ability to surprise and delight is a lot easier at this point. And so it's not the idea of creating Baked Alaskas that are going to be flaming all over the place. It's not the intense excitement that we might have had to talk about if we were a year and a half ago. Now it's going to be something a great deal more basic than that. So these are real pictures, and just to give you an idea of how consumers are dealing with this, my boyfriend and I ordered dinner from a fine dining restaurant near us. Yes, this is from a fine dining restaurant. We've been to it a number of different times, had wonderful experiences every time, great service, just great food. So we ordered Thanksgiving dinner, and this is how it arrived. There was no note. There was no Happy Thanksgiving. The food was delivered like this. Just so you know, on the left-hand side, this was a charcuterie board. So it was a far cry from surprising and delighting. In fact, I have to say, as somebody who's in the industry and certainly appreciates everything that operators have been through over the last, at that point, 9 months, just about, I was shocked at how disappointed I was by the presentation and I guess the thoughtlessness ultimately that I felt that went into this. And I think that really struck home to me that if I'm not the average consumer, imagine the disappointment of the average consumer and how easy it is not just to surprise and delight them, but to disappoint them at this point because their expectations are low enough that if you end up disappointing them, it's really dropping the experience into the basement, essentially. So part of this also has to do with a complete change in consumer habits. Whether it's at-home habits or away-from-home habits, consumers' habits have been essentially blown up. Part of what this means for us as an industry is that the ability to grab new customers is actually greater than it's probably ever been before because consumers now are open to new experiences, new venues, new items, largely because they've been forced to. Nearly 3/4 of consumers have had to try something new, whether that's a new product category, a new venue to go to, a new brand that they might not have tried before because of shortages, lockdowns, closures, and the rest. And the big thing here is that the majority are planning on, to some degree or another, sticking with these new products or categories or venues that they've gone to. It's a great opportunity for restaurants to begin to draw in traffic and customers and patrons that they have not been able to grab before. However, on the flip side, it's also an enormous challenge because we can no longer, as operators, expect our average consumers or our regular guests to continue going. We can't just assume that they will resume their habitual behavior with us. And I think that just goes back to the idea of identifying peak moments and always being conscious of the fact that now we have to rebuild essentially the brand loyalty that we all had going into the pandemic and have, to a certain degree, if not lost, then that brand loyalty has certainly eroded and been significantly weakened. So nothing can be taken for granted at this point. It needs to be a constant vigilance about ensuring the consistent experience, whether it's with the food, the service, a takeout situation, or whatever it ends up being. And this disruption of habits, particularly away from home habits with regard to restaurants, has impacted some operators a great deal more than others. As you can imagine, coffee houses, bakeries, that sort of thing that were visited largely through commuting, was part of a day-to-day behavior. They've been hit harder than virtually any other restaurant segment at this point. And I think it just goes to show that this has really disrupted everything. And even at-home habits have disrupted other habits. So I think that we really need to, as operators, think about what our defensible competitive position is. What is it that any operator has to offer that is truly unique from other operators? Because consumers will be thinking about their behavior in a much different way. They're not just going to go essentially mindlessly visiting places they visited before, because now they will know that there are other options. They will have had to find those other options. And every operator needs to have that compelling reason to break out of the new habits, essentially, that have been built over the pandemic and come back into our operations. It's a constant weighing of the value of the visit and the value of the occasion spent with us, essentially. What every operator needs to do, whether it's a restaurant, a hotel, a resort, anything along those lines, you need to deconstruct your entire experience from the minute that a patron walks through the door to the minute they leave, or whether it's with the food that they're picking up or from an on-site occasion. Deconstruct that and think about every element through the service, through the plating, the food experience, the packaging, the interaction with the staff, with the food, whatever it ends up being, what are those elements of that experience that you can truly own more than any other competitor? What is it about each one of those elements that you can deconstruct and own that makes your operation and the experience a patron will have at your operation truly unique at this point, and really create that a lasting surprise and delight that will lodge itself in their psyche and ensure that going forward they will be thinking about your operation as one of those operations they have to go back to because they had such an amazing experience. This is really critical. Part of this largely is based on the fact that consumers have a heightened fear of wasting, whether it's their money, their time, their occasion, or really in the case of restaurants, whether we think that it's fair or not, the idea that they are putting themselves at risk. We all know that restaurants pose virtually no greater risk than going grocery shopping, but because of all the news, a lot of consumers now see a restaurant visit as a riskier occasion than several other things they might be doing out of the house. So if they are going to decide to eat on site, more so than anything else, but even go to pick something up, there's an element of risk, whether it's conscious or subconscious, and they don't want to feel like they just created this risk in their life for no real payoff. I know it's a different way for us to be thinking because obviously nobody had to really think about this in the past other than basic food safety, but it's true. And so this idea of wasting an occasion is even greater than it used to be. So it just goes back. I mean, I can't emphasize enough the need to ensure that every occasion is consistent. And here we're talking about the increased importance of consistency in service, consistency in quality, consistency in the integrity of the experience. So once you identify, for example, those elements you can own and the peak moments of the experience that any patron will have dining with you or taking food to go, whatever you're offering, you need to make sure that that experience is consistent, that every time they come in, it's going to be as good as the time before, if not better. Consistency now is more important than anything. Take, for example, delivery. Delivery, if we were to think of consumers by age and experience, before the pandemic, on average, consumers were, let's say, teenagers with regard to their level of experience and knowledge of delivery. It was growing in importance. For some operators, obviously, it was critical. But generally speaking, across the board in the industry, you know, it wasn't necessarily the primary issue. But now, only a year later, we've gone from being teenagers in our level of experience and expertise with delivery to essentially late 20-year-olds to maybe early 30-year-olds. I mean, we have advanced as patrons significantly. And so our expectations and our critique of any delivered experience is going to be a great deal different. And the same goes for on-site as a result. So ultimately, the industry now has to build this value proposition for consumers. Why come back to the industry? And it can't just be because you loved it before the pandemic, you'll love it now. There has to be a more thoughtful approach to the value proposition. What do we have to offer consumers who have been learning how to cook to varying degrees in-house, who have been taking care of their own food requirements with less input from restaurants because of lockdowns? What makes us special? Why should they spend their money with us? This, of course, is an extreme example of a restaurant that's truly unique, but every restaurant from QSRs all the way through to the highest end resort that's in this country have something special to offer, appropriate to their concept and level. Ultimately, however, I think what the industry has to offer is hospitality. And I think that over the last few years, our industry was rocking. We didn't have to worry as much about hospitality. People were just going to come because it was part of their behavior, because restaurants had become ingrained in our culture, that hospitality became kind of secondary to a lot of operators. Not all, certainly, but to a lot of operators. And hospitality has to come back because what we have to offer that the supermarket doesn't offer, food cooked at home doesn't necessarily have to offer, any other options that can replace restaurants. What they can't give is the idea of hospitality. It's this generosity and kindness. I mean, all of these terms, I'm sure all of you could add other terms that help to define what true hospitality is. And it doesn't have to be fine dining level hospitality. Again, every operator can offer hospitality of some kind. And ultimately, it comes back to the gratitude that we can show our patrons through careful service, through consistent quality, through thoughtful experiences that they have when they come to visit us. This is what we really have to offer them. And I think as an industry, we need to go back to this and really begin to re-emphasize the issue of hospitality through the entire experience, service to food, to departure, essentially. And that's true too of off-premise, as I know many of you have had to either incorporate off-premise for a temporary period or potentially now for long-term. Hospitality has to be delivered through the off-premise occasion as well, and often that's neglected across the board because it's off-premise. You think, well, they're just taking the food away, but there are ways. Think back to that Thanksgiving dinner. There are ways that they could have provided hospitality, and as simple as just putting in a card to say thank you very much for entrusting your holiday to us. So the steps are simple, but they can be very, very meaningful going forward. This is particularly an interesting issue with Gen Z. So the youngest generation that we have now in our country, it's roughly 22 years of age down to about 6. Everybody has their own definition, but that's about the age range. These consumers have grown up with technology, and they were constantly called technology natives. They communicated with everyone through electrical devices. We all assumed as an industry going forward that we needed technology to interact with these consumers because that was what they would prefer, not human interaction. Over the pandemic, however, Gen Z has experienced the most significant mental health impact of any generation in the country, which is kind of amazing because you think that they would have been built for lockdown, where all they could do was communicate through Skype and Zoom and everything else. But the reality is that these the technology that they had relied on and taken for granted and used constantly did not help at all. In fact, they were more likely and more susceptible to have depression, to just have all different types of mental issues as a result of this, which is going to be a significant situation for our country to deal with going forward, but it's a story for another day. That being said, I think hospitality and human connection will ironically be more important to this generation. It doesn't mean that technology is not important to them anymore or that they're abandoning technology, but I think technology has to offer impactful solutions coupled with real hospitality from a food service point of view. We can't just say technology is going to take the place of people and we don't need to offer that kind of hospitality to this generation. I actually think the reverse is going to be true, particularly over the next probably two to 5 years. And considering how young these consumers are, this change in their behavior is significant because their habits are still developing, and this whole situation has completely thrown a monkey wrench into their development as a generation. The impact this will have on them will be even longer lasting for that generation than it will be for mine. I'm a Gen Xer, certainly for the boomers and even for the millennials, particularly the older millennials. So let's talk for a minute about the impact on restaurants because it has an impact on food trends. In particular, what we've seen through this pandemic, and I'm sure this is not going to surprise anyone, is that independent full-service restaurants, particularly fine dining, have been hit harder than any other segment from a restaurant point of view. Right now, the estimate of closures, and this is a combined permanent and temporary closure rate, is about 12% of all restaurants, across chains, independents, all of the segments. You look at fine dining, nearly 20% of fine dining are now closed, largely permanently. So that hurts as an industry. It's hard to see those numbers, but it has a significant impact on where we're going to head as an industry. In particular, the closure of all of these independent restaurants, particularly the fine dining, is going to have an impact on trends moving forward. If you think about the trend life cycle, how things start off largely, primarily at fine dining, as well as independent world cuisine restaurants, they are the operators who initially start experimenting, who bring in and introduce new flavors, ingredients, techniques, cuisines into the US market. With the significant loss in that area, we're going to see a deceleration, at least for the next 12 to 18 months, potentially longer, depending on how quickly those segments can come back, of the trend life cycle. Things are going to move slower. Chain restaurants and even retail are going to own a larger share of the impact of trends. And of course, chain restaurants and retail are focused on mass market. They're not going to be introducing really unique, innovative, challenging, exciting options. So over the next 12 to 18 months, things are going to be somewhat conservative with regard to trends, kind of quiet until fine dining and the independent world cuisine restaurants can come back. So that's going to have some impact on what's going on and what consumers are expecting. The other thing that's going to happen is, if you think about the impact of the pandemic economically, unlike the Great Recession, which really cut a pretty broad swath, through all demographics, we're all almost equally impacted to a certain degree economically. Here, however, the economic impact has been not exclusively, but primarily in lower income patrons. That has a twofold impact on how we're going to go forward as an industry. Number one, it impacts our labor. Depending on how the economic stimulus packages go, any kind of additional economic support for the people who would have worked in our operations, it may be hard to get them into work or back into the employment lines, or out of the unemployment lines. That's going to stress technology solutions, robotics. It's going to change the way we look at our menu, the breadth of our menu, the skill needed for the different items, and how we approach innovation. On the flip side, however, going back to that idea of the fine dining and the independent restaurants, those are niche operators. They don't look to have a broad mass market appeal. Largely the individuals who go to fine dining restaurants, certainly, and to a more limited degree, the independent world cuisine restaurants, are higher income. So while you can't obviously discount the horrible impact that it's had to lower income patrons, what this means is that we might see a faster recovery than currently expected with fine dining and independent world cuisine restaurants, because their patrons have not been as hard hit economically. Now, again, that doesn't mean that they're definitely all going to come back or they're going to come back the same. I return to that idea that we always need to be vigilant in creating surprise and delight for those patrons, but still, it will hopefully bode well for recovery. The other thing that we're seeing now, because of the shift in consumers moving out of a lot of the urban areas, New York is at historic lows, or I should say historic highs in people leaving. LA is the same. Chicago has been experiencing years worth of declining population, with the pandemic only increasing that. That's not to say that the populations won't ever come back, but it's opening up opportunities in rural and suburban areas for new restaurants to open. And this is going to be really interesting because it's going to change the face of our industry. If rural and suburban areas now have a greater density than before of fine dining operators, really innovative food service options, then it's going to start shifting how operators, again, think about innovation. What kind of services are they offering? What kind of foods? And the food trends will be touching a much wider array of consumers, which could ultimately, in the next 2 to 3 years, speed up the trend life cycle more than we've seen in any other year before this. Because the more people who get exposed at a faster rate, the faster it can be adopted and the quicker we need to move on to something new. So it's really interesting time, obviously not great in a lot of ways, but if you think about the future, it's very exciting to think of where the industry can go. So let's get in the last 20 minutes or so. What does all this mean really looking forward with regard to innovation and food? This is clearly not looking forward. This is current pandemic. However, there are two things in this picture that I think speak to what things will be like afterwards and what will impact both service and food. Number one, these igloos and the greenhouses and this idea of closing off tables so that people feel safe, right? That's why we're doing it right now, is actually shifting the locus of concern and attention away from the broader operation. It used to be you'd go into a restaurant and largely you wanted to see what the experience was, who was there, you know, the excitement of seeing to be seen and all of this. Now that's really not the case because the focus inherently has to be on the table, and largely a lot of people who are going out in groups more than 2 or 3 are seeing people they haven't seen for months and months, of maybe family, maybe friends. And so the focus really is almost entirely on the table itself. This can change operations, service style, design, even site location. So I think we can't underestimate the impact of these types of solutions that were originally for the pandemic, but how it will change the experience consumers want and are expecting and are focused on when they actually go out. The second thing, which seems counterintuitive, but still, is a lot of it's moved outside, and certainly in the urban areas like this, what it's done is removed the focus from the inside of the operation and shifted it to the exterior experience. And that is not just for the operation, but it's what's happening on the street, what's happening at the operation right next door. So you know, while the tables might be focused on themselves, suddenly the tables are no longer in the operation. It increases the distance from the kitchen to the table, which is going to inherently have to change the way food is served in order to maintain its integrity from a temperature point of view. It's going to change a lot of different issues. Weather is going to impact this. This is not going away, the outdoor dining, for a number of different reasons. So we as an industry need to figure out how to ensure that the outdoor dining experience is as incredible as the indoor dining experience and not lose that, quite frankly, the brand integrity. Even if you're dining outside, you still need to know that you're dining here at our operation and not at the operation maybe 2 doors down, as you might have in an urban area. Another thing that's happened is through the pandemic, this idea of the focus on the table and the people that you're eating with really goes hand in hand with this idea of being more compassionate and concerned about others. Not to get into the politics of mask wearing, but the reason we've all been told, and the majority, I think, of us have embraced the idea of wearing masks is to protect others. It's empathy and focus typically beforehand was actually internally driven, which is why customization needed to be so big. I wanted what I want, when I want it, how I want it. Now, suddenly, everyone's concerned about their community, the restaurant workers in their community, their loved ones, and how they're taking care of their loved ones or their neighbors. It's really a fundamental shift that again, can't be understated. But hand in hand with this, particularly with the masks, is an increased focus on sustainability and environmental impact. Some of that was certainly put to the back burner during the pandemic because we needed to shift to single-use plastics and single-use containers for hygiene and safety, whether it was for dining in or taking out. There were compromises that were made, but during lockdown, there were incredible images of how nature came back and the skies cleared because we took humans essentially out of the environment. All of the groups that focus on these issues are going to have incredible images to ramp back up essentially in sustainability discussions. What is really interesting, however, about this idea of sustainability is the definition of sustainability over the last year, maybe year and a half, has actually begun to expand. Originally, sustainability was focused almost exclusively on the environment. What was your environmental impact, your carbon footprint, water waste, all of that. But it was very environmental, it was very targeted. I recently did a research project with a partner, and we just got the results back, so you're among the first group to hear about any of this. what we found was across all generations, the definition of sustainability has now expanded to include animal welfare. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean we're all becoming vegans, but there's a concern about the way in which we are treating the animals that we are ultimately eating. This is now wrapped up in sustainability. Sustainability is now also including diversity, and social justice issues are now wrapped up in sustainability. Worker safety and workers' rights are also now wrapped up largely in sustainability. And this is challenging because then how do you as an operator approach sustainability? But on the flip side, this also gives you a lot of different directions that fit your brand and your mission statement and how you want to approach the world and the marketplace. There's a lot of ways that you can tackle this. So it's both a challenge and an opportunity, I think, for all. But one thing that I think is good news for not just our industry, but any industry looking to be more sustainability, is that the definition of sustainability is also now increasingly incorporating the idea that businesses need to be able to make money while being sustainable. So before, profitability, business sense was really not part of the definition of sustainability, but now, and I think this is actually really going to be driven by Gen Z, which is a more common sense, I guess, generation than necessarily the millennials were. They understand that in order for sustainability to be sustainable for the long term, businesses need to be profitable and they need to be able to make money while being sustainable. So this will hopefully carry through and we will see this persist so that if sustainability really is going to be a large part of what you're doing, you can price things out accordingly based on the decisions that you're making. A few final considerations before I open it up to questions. First of all, I mentioned that, and I'm sure you all know, that consumers have been cooking more at home, whether that is true cooking from scratch or preparing from value-added options at the grocery store. The reality is that while not all consumers will continue their behavior post-pandemic, many will probably shift to going back to restaurants full-time, maybe to more of a hybrid approach. But what they won't lose are the skills and the knowledge that increased cooking at home has given them. That means that as an industry, we can start changing our conversation with them about preparations and ingredients and other elements of the food experience that now many of them have a greater appreciation and a wider knowledge base of. So I think that is definitely something that can lend itself to, again, creating that value add and why is coming out special and different. Because also think about the things that they now know how to make at home and have made a lot are likely not the items that they want to have when they go to restaurants. So even as we talk about comfort food, it's not offering them the same comfort food they've had at home. That's not special. That's not unique. That's not a value add. It's offering them the comfort food that is more difficult, more challenging, takes more skill. Maybe the ingredients aren't available, and shifting the restaurant value proposition to create, again, that reason to come out and why restaurants are so special compared to at home. Functional, health, and indulgence are all tied up together at this point. There's no doubt that after a year plus of worrying about whether we're going to get sick from COVID-19, that foods that are functional and support immunity, even mood, stress, sleep, any of these are going to become very important. Now, that's not to say that all restaurants should be suddenly changing to a healthful focus, but there are ingredients like turmeric that were growing beforehand and now have a certain density of understanding, of, I would guess breadth of understanding, not density, across consumers, that if they are incorporated in meals, they immediately lend a health halo without an operator having to say this specifically is a healthy meal. But while consumers are going to be more concerned about what they're eating and focus to a greater degree than previously on their health and the role that food plays in their health, they are also going to want indulgence, particularly from restaurants, again, because they will have been making food at home that is likely not as indulgent as what they can get away from. So there are ways, I think, for the industry to create dishes that incorporate functional ingredients, but lend themselves to indulgent experiences. even while having a healthy halo. Some of the ingredients that we're seeing growing now, specifically, I mentioned turmeric, ginger, pomegranate, honey. Those aren't new, but they are growing now for different reasons and in different ways. Honey, in particular, fermented honey and different versions of honey are making that very familiar and ubiquitous category more interesting. You've got elderberry, ginseng, caffeine, which is interesting because caffeine actually can support immunity. So while caffeine has been around and a lot of us need it in the morning, I know I certainly do, it's now taking on a different role, which is interesting, and it's being incorporated in food rather than just beverages. And of course, mushrooms. All of this is really speaking to this idea of pro and prebiotics. Even postbiotics are becoming a big issue. Nootropics, adaptogens, all of these are terms that consumers are going to become increasingly familiar with, and depending on the operation that they're visiting, may or may not place a greater emphasis on expecting. This all, of course, plays into the idea of plant-based and plant-forward food. I mentioned we are not all becoming vegans. I don't think that's going to happen for quite some time in this country, but everyone is now far more focused on produce becoming a larger share of the meal. Animal proteins will increasingly become a smaller share of an overall dish, but I think they need to be thoughtful and good quality and presented in a way that is meaningful, and I mean that with the animal protein. But plant forward is not going anywhere. It's only increasing in importance. And a note on the lab-based meat alternatives. While I think they will continue to grow, it's an interesting dynamic with them because they've had to shift to retail because food service closed down. So in order to continue their growth, they needed to move to retail. Now, their increased availability in retail means that they are less special for away from home, because now you can get them in the grocery store. Is that really something to have if they go out to a restaurant or if they're staying at a hotel? So I think here with those, while they'll continue to grow at restaurants, particularly I think in the chains, I think restaurants, again, thinking of how to make restaurants special, have the opportunity to create plant-based burger alternatives that are made with whole ingredients, something that you can only get at this operation. It's very unique, the way we prepare it, the ingredients we used, and I think that's probably where that category is headed in food service. I mentioned comfort at the very beginning. It's important for us all to remember that it's easy to go back to traditional American comfort, but the reality is that comfort, the definition of comfort food, particularly for millennials and Gen Z, has expanded significantly to incorporate all different kinds of world cuisine comfort food, ramen to gusado, all different iterations of foods that consumers are familiar with to varying degrees, whether it's a pasta noodle or a stew. There are a lot of different ways that other cultures approach it. And so comfort does not always need to be what is most commonly thought of by the most traditional American cuisine standards. The other thing, of course, is travel has been upset. Many of you are hotel operators, lodging, resorts. I'm not telling you anything you don't know, but I think when we do begin to travel more, when people feel more comfortable, the vaccines roll out, it is going to be largely domestically focused, in part because we can't travel to a lot of places internationally, but I think that's going to increase the desire to understand more about the unique food options in this country. And I don't mean just South, Midwest, West, and Northeast. I mean hyper-regionalism. So all of you that have properties in multiple locations, how do you create menus that really start playing on that? Because American consumers in particular, who are going to be traveling largely domestically, they are going to be looking for some of that uniqueness. As part of social justice and all of the Black Lives Matter movement through the summer, and obviously the concern ongoing, I think we're going to see a real resurgence and a vibrancy in the idea of Black foodways, Indigenous American cuisine, and all of these cuisines that have sort of bubbled up every once in a while, but never really kind of had that real focus in our industry. I think now we're going to be seeing that over the next 12 to 24 months, which I think is very exciting. And it ties into the hyper-regionalism because there is an incredible hyper-regionalism within these foodways and with Indigenous cuisine that can really create some stunning and interesting dishes. Stepping a bit back from food, I think we need to think when we're talking about indulgence, and I talked about it with regard to health, that indulgence can be a lot of different things. It certainly is tied into food, like a dessert as beautiful as this one, but it can be, indulgence in time. Somebody finally having the time to sit at a restaurant and enjoy their time there. It's space. I think consumers are going to be more focused on having more personal space, which impacts interior restaurant design, table turns, and everything. But I think they will want more of that space, maybe not 6 feet, but still. And then indulgence in reliability and knowing that when you go here to spend your money, it's going to be great every single time. Work from home, and I think we're going to see a permanent decline in commuting. Commuting will come back, but it's not at the levels that it was. Even those who might come back to the office are likely going to be more part-time than full-time in many cases. So this may or may not impact your operation, but it is something to think about, particularly for breakfast and lunch, because again, this is a significant disruption in habits. So how do you draw consumers out of the home for breakfast and lunch? What's that compelling argument that you have to make, either with your food offerings, your service, time, whatever it ends up being? Also, this is going to impact business travel. I think domestic personal travel is going to come back well before business travel will come back. And of course, as lodging operators, that will impact who's visiting, why they're visiting, and what kind of services and food they're expecting. I'm not going to spend a ton of time on this, but I think you all know that curbside pickup delivery is going to be with us to stay. It may decline a bit once we actually get fully through the pandemic, but many operators are going to continue to incorporate this into their concepts. And I think we need to be thoughtful in it, far more thoughtful now. How do you ensure that the food that an individual has on site is going to be as good as much as possible in an off-premise occasion? This is partially what's also driving ghost kitchens, is the ability to maybe remove the off-premise from a concept that wasn't originally supposed to have it, but still allow for that incremental income. Although I think ghost kitchens will continue to evolve. It'll be interesting to see where they go ultimately, but I think they're certainly here to stay, and they will be growing at a significant rate, far faster than we saw before the pandemic. And then nearly finally, beverage-focused innovation opportunities. CBD, you can't overstate the degree to which CBD is impacting this category. It's impacting food, certainly, but beverages, unbelievable. And it creates some challenges for restaurants, whether it's regulations by state, although it'll be interesting to see what happens with the new administration along these lines. But I think this is certainly going to be an enormous area for both alcoholic and non-alcoholic. Functional beverages ties back into everything I was saying earlier about health. Hard alternatives, this is everything from kombucha to coffee to tea. Everything is going to become hard to a certain degree. And so that offers some interesting opportunities. Carbonation, again, carbonated coffee, carbonated iced teas, anything that isn't a soda being carbonated will be an area of growth. We will see more low and no alcohol advances. There is an unbelievable array at this point of spiritless spirits, well beyond Seedlip, who for this market in the US was the real first entrant. Arguably, internationally, we're seeing a great deal more innovation in this area than we have seen so far in the US, but undoubtedly companies in the US will catch up. And this, whether they're mocktails or regular cocktails, again, I think we're going to see cocktails reignited as soon as consumers can come back and sit in house, because cocktails are not something that most people can easily make at home. Most people don't have an infinite bar or the effort or the energy very often at the end of the day to create a complicated cocktail. This is definitely an area where restaurants can create a really unique point of differentiation. And finally, you're going to get this deck, so I'm not going to go through all of this, but there are, despite what I said about the fine dining restaurants and the slowdown of trends, we are seeing innovation happen, but a lot of this is more iterative than truly unique. Mushrooms were growing beforehand, now they're just advancing farther. Chickpeas certainly had a huge heyday with hummus. Now they're kind of being pulled out of the hummus and approached in a different way. Spices and herbs have been around. Now we're just using them in different ways in different applications. So there is innovation. It's a bit more iterative, but I would say to you, think of how you can create an unexpected experience without pushing the bounds too far beyond your patrons' comfort zones, at least for the near future. You know your patrons better than I do, and I wouldn't say that there's ever going to be one solution for all. But I think about that idea of the need for a certain amount of simplicity going forward, at least for the near term, until we truly get past the pandemic and people are ready to start being challenged and experiencing truly new situations. And then finally, the question is, because of all of this, everybody's in pajamas half the time, you know, staying at home, barely putting on shoes. You know, even when they go out, it's largely off premise. Does this mean that we have now walked back largely from luxury? I personally do not think so. I think there is, of course, the casualization of luxury. We saw that happening before the pandemic. Some of that will continue, but I think now the restaurant experience will almost go back to what it was 3 or 4 decades ago, where going out, particularly to sit at a restaurant, is a great deal more special than it used to be. It is a real occasion now. People can get dressed up, they can put on high heels, you know, wear makeup, put on jewelry, put on their best suits, whatever it is, because they haven't been doing that. And now suddenly that's a great deal more special and exciting than it used to be. So I don't think that we have abandoned luxury. If anything, I think over the next 6 or 7 months, luxury will be even more interesting to consumers at various levels. So with that, I know we've got about 10 minutes left. I would love to answer any questions, you know, address any issues or concerns that you might have. And of course, going forward, you've got my contact information. I know Jacqueline will be posting this. So even if you don't have a question now, if something comes up, do not hesitate at any time to contact me, and I'd be more than happy to answer your questions and help out in any way I can.
Wow. That was amazing, Maeve. Thank you so much. I'm going to let you take a sip of water if you need one before you dive into the questions. And just say, you never cease to amaze me. You are brilliant, super articulate. I mean, you just powered through 52 minutes of constant content that's super duper valuable. So thank you for that. But as you've just said, you're also incredibly connected. And so chefs, also accessible as you need to reach out to Maeve to ask questions or delve a little bit deeper into something, or can you explain again once you get this deck, because it is so narrated by Maeve. There's not a lot of actual words on the screen. If you want to remember what it was all about, I can certainly help connect you guys together. And then of course this has been recorded. So hopefully with that sip of beverage, you can be ready for some questions. I know a few folks have turned their cameras back on. I have muted everybody during this process, so you might have to unmute yourself to be heard. But Gerard, did you have a question? Did you want to start?
Yes, I had a question. During this time, can you give us an example of a restaurant chain or hotel or restaurant who has been the most innovative on finding new solution? I know you travel, you've been looking at what's going on in the market. Who will really impress you with innovation?
It's a great question. I'm always bad at being put on the spot with regard to remembering brands. It's like walking into when you used to walk into a record store, I could never remember who I even listened to. I will say places like First Watch has been really innovative in approaching, as a chain restaurant, approaching their menu and solutions, particularly during the pandemic. I think we saw a lot of independent operators, and I apologize that I don't have a specific example, but during the pandemic, the independent operators in particular were incredibly innovative in thinking about the solutions that their patrons needed versus what their concept was about and what they wanted to bring to the market. And that's why we saw things like pantries, food kitchens, donations to the poor, helping the community out by sewing masks. That was Raising Cane put their workers, the furloughed workers, to work sewing masks early on. So I think that there are definitely a lot of operators. When it comes to hotels, I've traveled a little and I've seen some not so great behavior. Understandable, because everybody's trying to navigate, and a lot of operators that I went to were very early on. Actually, here's an example I would like to give you. that's not a restaurant, but from a communication point of view, I think that they are the gold standard. And that's the Vermont Country Store here in Vermont. I know that sounds odd, but considering how many times any consumer, whether they were going to a store or a restaurant, were told no, you have to wear your mask, you have to leave after an hour, we're not going to offer you this, we're not going to offer you that. It was nothing but a string of no's. The Vermont Country Store put a guy out front who was the perfect personality for this, and he ran you through the nose, but then he told you everything that you could do, everything that they were doing for you, all the experiences that you could have, so that the no's were all offset by great messaging that made you excited to go in there, even though the experience was not what it used to be. And the last thing that they said was, "We are so happy you're here. Thank you for coming, and we're looking forward to making your visit here great." And I think a lot of operators, while they were focused on all the regulations they had to manage, forgot to tell people why they should be happy to be at the restaurant. And so while it's not a restaurant example, it is an example of what I would consider gold star messaging during a really difficult time.
No, that's a very good point. We can all use that for sure.
Yeah. Any other questions? Well, it's a lot of information, so I understand it's a lot to digest. But like I said, I'm here for you all. Jacqueline can get you in touch with me. You've got my contact in the deck, so I'm more than happy, even if it's just to brainstorm and throw ideas against the wall. So don't ever hesitate to reach out.
Thank you so
Okay.
much, Maeve. And Sebastian, did you want to have your final words?
Yes, I would like to thank you, Maeve, and bravo. That was a
Yes.
fantastic presentation.
My pleasure.
And I hope that I will have to watch it again. I'm sure I have some question, but I will have to watch it again. There was so many information and very instructive. And I know everybody looks like enjoy that. It's fantastic. And I also would like to thank Jacqueline for her help today, as usual. Thank you, Jacqueline.
Absolutely happy to help.
And Chef, don't hesitate if you have any question, contact Jacqueline or Maeve. Anyway, we're going to post the whole today webinar on our website, so you can always go back to it, watch it again like me, and ask the question you need to ask. Okay? Thank you so much, guys. Good luck to
Thank
you.
you, everyone.
If I could have asked one more thing, do not forget to register for International Sous Vide Day. I'm doing my little plug. It's going to be a lot of fun. We have some ACF member, Daniel Boulou, Kyle, a lot of really interesting. We have 4 chefs around the world doing cooking sous vide, one from France, Dubai, Thailand, US. So it's going to be a lot of fun on 26. So register fast. We're giving some stuff away. So it's going to be a big celebration about sous vide. Sorry for the plug.
Fantastic.
Take
Thank
care,
you all
guys.
so much. Have a good one.
Yep. Bye.
Thank you, everyone.
Bye. Take care.